Rome was a city built on marble and fear, a place where power lived behind columns and silence. And in the year when destiny shifted, a teenage girl was quietly led into the heart of that machine, unaware that her name would one day echo through history as a warning rather than a memory. Valeria Messalina was born into privilege, surrounded by noble blood and dangerous connections, raised in a world where family alliances mattered more than innocence. And from a young age, she learned that survival in Rome depended not on virtue, but on proximity to power. At 15 or 16, still closer to childhood than womanhood, she was married to a man twice her age, a man mocked by his own family, dismissed as weak, stammering, and unfit to rule, a man nobody believed would ever sit on the imperial throne. That man was Claudius, and at the time of their marriage, their union seemed unimportant, almost forgettable, another political arrangement in a city full of them. Yet Rome has a way of transforming the ordinary into the catastrophic. In 41 CE, blood spilled in the palace. Emperor Caligula was murdered by his own guards, and in the chaos that followed, Claudius was discovered hiding behind a curtain, shaking, terrified, and utterly unprepared. The Praetorian Guard dragged him into the light and declared him emperor, not because he was strong, but because he was convenient. In a single moment, the forgotten husband became the ruler of the known world, and the teenage bride beside him became Empress of Rome. From that day forward, every step Messalina took was watched, whispered about, and judged, because Rome feared powerful women even more than weak men. Ancient writers describe a palace filled with torchlight and secrets, where influence flowed through corridors like poison, and where a young empress learned quickly that survival required control. According to the historians, it was here that restraint vanished, that ambition hardened, and that the image of Messalina transformed from noble bride into something far more disturbing. But these stories come to us filtered through decades of resentment, political agendas, and moral panic, written by men who believed female power was unnatural and dangerous. As we open the ancient texts, written long after her death, we must ask whether we are reading truth or a carefully constructed nightmare, designed to justify what Rome would later do to her. Because in this city, reputation was not just gossip. It was a sentence, and once Rome decided who you were, there was no escaping the role it wrote for you. And as Messalina stood at the center of empire, young, isolated, and dangerously visible, the stage was already set for a scandal, so shocking that even Rome would pretend it had never happened. Once Valeria Messalina became empress, Rome did what? It always did best when faced with a woman too close to power. It watched her obsessively, whispered about her relentlessly, and waited for her to fail. The palace was no longer just a home, but a living organism filled with spies, freedmen, servants, and senators' wives, all listening, all reporting, all reshaping rumor into accusation. Ancient Rome did not separate morality from politics. And female sexuality, especially when linked to authority, was treated as a threat to the natural order. According to the historians who wrote years later, Messalina quickly abandoned restraint. Yet these same writers lived in a culture where ambition in a woman was automatically translated into excess, and independence was rebranded as depravity. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio describe scenes so extreme that they border on myth, tales of an empress who humiliated noble families, ignored tradition, and turned power into personal pleasure. But what matters most is not just what they claimed, but why they claimed it. These accounts were written after Messalina was dead, after her name had been officially erased, after the state itself had declared her memory corrupt. And in Rome, once damnation was declared, truth no longer mattered. To understand these stories, we must understand the world that produced them, a world ruled by men who feared disorder more than cruelty, and believed that unchecked female influence would rot the empire from within. Claudius, awkward, cautious, and politically vulnerable, relied heavily on advisors and freedmen, creating resentment among the old elite. And Messalina stood at the center of that resentment, an easy target onto whom every frustration could be projected. Any political execution could be blamed on her manipulation, any corruption on her appetite, any shift in power on her supposed immorality, until her image became less a person and more a symbol of everything Rome feared losing control over. Behind marble walls and bronze doors, fear mixed with ambition, and stories grew darker with every retelling, because scandal was useful, scandal distracted, and scandal justified violence. Yet even as accusations multiplied, there was a silence. At the heart of the palace, a silence created by the absence of Messalina's own voice, because no letters, no speeches, no personal defenses survived. What we have instead are fragments written by her enemies, shaped by political survival and moral panic. And as those fragments hardened into history, the line between documented crime and ritualized character destruction disappeared completely. Rome needed Messalina to be monstrous, because monsters make executions feel righteous, and as the empire watched her more closely, the whispers turned into certainty, the certainty into outrage, and outrage into preparation. Somewhere within those corridors, while the emperor governed and the city pretended to be stable, events were already moving toward a moment so shocking that even Rome would struggle to explain it. A moment that would force power to finally choose between tolerance and annihilation. By the time the rumors surrounding Valeria Messalina reached their most disturbing form, the imperial palace itself had transformed in the Roman imagination from a seat of governance into a place of moral collapse, a symbol of everything that could go wrong when power slipped beyond traditional control. Ancient writers describe marble halls glowing with torchlight long after nightfall, doors closing softly behind forbidden meetings, and influence passing quietly from hand to hand. But beneath these dramatic images lies a more calculated reality, one shaped by fear, hierarchy, and survival. Rome was not shocked by corruption. It was built on it. Yet what unsettled the elite was not the idea of favors exchanged or rivals removed, but the suggestion that these acts were directed by a young empress rather than sanctioned by male authority. According to the sources, Messalina stood at the center of a hidden system where political access was allegedly sold, alliances forged in secrecy, and reputations destroyed with a whisper. But these claims emerged in a society where palace intrigue was normal and blame was a strategic choice. Claudius, increasingly distant from daily court life, relied on freedmen and administrators, weakening the traditional power of senators and noble families, and every decision that bypassed them deepened resentment. Messalina became the perfect explanation for this loss of influence, a convenient figure onto whom the chaos of imperial politics could be projected. In Roman culture, excess was not simply a personal failing. It was proof of unfitness to rule, and by framing the empress as uncontrollable, historians could retroactively justify the violence that would follow. Stories multiplied of secret gatherings, of moral boundaries dissolving within the palace, of an empress who treated authority as a personal domain rather than a public trust. Yet these accounts lack the precision of legal records and instead carry the rhythm of moral theater. They are designed to horrify, to instruct, and to warn, because Rome believed history's role was not to preserve nuance, but to enforce order. What is striking is how quickly the narrative shifts from political maneuvering to ritualized disgrace. As if power exercised by a woman required a different language, one saturated with taboo and humiliation. The palace, once a symbol of stability, becomes in these texts a corrupted space, and Messalina its embodiment, not because Rome discovered something new, but because it needed a face for its anxieties. As fear intensified, surveillance tightened, and loyalty thinned, the atmosphere grew heavy with inevitability. Every whispered accusation narrowed her options. Every retold story hardened public expectation, until scandal was no longer rumor but destiny. Rome had begun to prepare itself, consciously or not, for a decisive act, one that would cleanse the palace, restore moral order, and remind the empire that power, once challenged in the wrong way, would always respond with force. In the autumn of 48 CE, when the heat of Rome softened and the city exhaled into ritual and celebration, Valeria Messalina made a decision that even her enemies would later struggle to comprehend. A decision that pushed rumor into reality and transformed accusation into undeniable crisis. Emperor Claudius had left the city to inspect the harbor at Ostia, an ordinary act of governance that removed the ultimate authority from Rome for only a few days. Yet in those days, the careful balance of fear and silence collapsed. According to every surviving source, Messalina did not merely take a lover, something Roman elites quietly tolerated when it remained discreet, but instead participated in a full public marriage ceremony with Gaius Silius, a young, wealthy nobleman admired for his lineage and ambition. Witnesses were present, contracts were signed, a feast was held, and the rites were performed as if the emperor no longer existed, an act so audacious that it shattered all political logic. In Roman law and custom, this was not passion but treason, not scandal but rebellion, because marriage was a legal declaration of legitimacy and power. The historians argue over her motive, some insisting it was the opening move of a coup, others claiming obsession blinded her judgment, and still others suggesting boredom drove her to seek danger itself. Yet what matters most is that this moment crossed a boundary Rome could not forgive. An affair could be ignored, a rumor manipulated, but a public marriage forced the state to respond because it challenged the emperor's authority in front of the entire ruling class. The palace, once filled with whispers, now echoed with certainty, and those who had tolerated Messalina's influence began to distance themselves, sensing that survival required loyalty to the inevitable victor. As wine flowed and guests celebrated, unaware of how exposed they were, Rome's invisible machinery began to turn, driven by fear rather than morality. News traveled faster than loyalty, and it was only a matter of time before the emperor would learn that his wife had not simply embarrassed him, but replaced him. This was the moment when scandal hardened into destiny, when ambiguity vanished and the empire demanded blood to restore order. What followed would not be measured in rumor or reputation, but in arrests, executions, and erasure, because Rome had reached the point where it could no longer pretend this was a private matter. And as the city waited, balancing between disbelief and anticipation, one truth became unavoidable. Whatever Messalina intended, she had forced the empire to choose. And Rome never chose mercy when authority was challenged in the open. When the truth finally reached Claudius, it did not arrive as rumor or exaggeration, but as an accusation supported by witnesses, contracts, and terrified messengers who understood that delay meant death. One of the emperor's most trusted freedmen, Narcissus, intercepted him at Ostia and forced him to listen, repeating the words until disbelief gave way to shock, and shock hardened into humiliation. In Roman culture, a ruler could survive incompetence, even cruelty, but public dishonor was fatal. And Claudius now faced the most devastating insult imaginable, not just betrayal but replacement, enacted openly while he was still alive. As the emperor returned to Rome under guard, the city shifted instantly, loyalty dissolving with the speed of fear, as senators, nobles, and officials calculated who would live and who would fall. Valeria Messalina, still celebrating in the gardens of Lucullus with Gaius Silius and their guests, remained dangerously unaware that the political ground beneath her had already collapsed. The marriage feast, once an act of defiance, now became evidence, and the laughter of guests turned into silent terror as imperial soldiers arrived without warning. Arrests followed swiftly and without ceremony, because Rome no longer needed explanations, only obedience. Silius was seized first, stripped of all illusion, knowing that no defense could save him, and within hours, the man who had stood beside the Empress as her husband was executed without trial. His death meant not only as punishment, but as reassurance to a shaken empire. Those who had attended the wedding, senators, nobles, witnesses, were interrogated one by one. Their proximity to Messalina transformed into guilt by association, because Rome understood that terror worked best when it was indiscriminate. As Claudius moved through the palace, surrounded by guards and advisors, the emperor's weakness vanished, replaced by a cold determination shaped by survival rather than justice. Messalina herself attempted to reach him, sending messages, begging for an audience, clinging to the belief that their shared children or her past influence might still protect her. But the machinery of power had already moved beyond emotion. Once Rome decided someone had become a threat to order, there was no return, only removal. The city watched as her allies disappeared. Her name became dangerous to speak, and the woman who had once stood at the center of empire was reduced to a problem that required a final solution. And as night fell over Rome, one question remained unanswered, not whether Messalina would survive, but whether history would ever allow her to explain herself before silence closed in completely. The end of Valeria Messalina did not come with a public trial or a chance to speak, because Rome did not want testimony. It wanted closure, and closure required silence. Ancient sources describe her final hours as isolated and stripped of all power, removed from the palace and placed under guard in the gardens of Lucullus, a space once associated with pleasure and influence, now transformed into a waiting room for death. Messages were sent one last time to Claudius, appeals framed around their shared children and years of marriage. But the emperor hesitated only briefly, not out of mercy, but uncertainty, because even now he struggled to act decisively. It was his advisors, fearing reversal and instability, who ensured the decision would not be undone, because in Rome hesitation was more dangerous than cruelty. An officer was dispatched, orders were carried out, and Messalina was killed without ceremony, her death swift and deliberately unmemorable, as if the state itself wished to pretend she had already vanished. Immediately afterward, her memory was condemned, her name erased from public monuments, her statues destroyed, and her story handed over to historians who would shape it according to Rome's needs. What followed was not investigation, but narrative, a process in which complex political realities were simplified into moral theater, and a woman once central to empire became a symbol of excess, corruption, and warning. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio wrote with confidence about her crimes. Yet their certainty rests on a world that had already decided she must be guilty, because Rome required her to be monstrous in order to justify what it had done. With Messalina gone, order was restored, alliances stabilized, and the emperor remarried, proof that the system had corrected itself. But beneath that stability lies an uncomfortable truth, that history often survives, not as a record of events, but as a reflection of who was allowed to speak after the violence ended. Messalina left no account of her own life, no defense, no explanation, only fragments written by those who benefited from her destruction. And so her legacy remains suspended between scandal and suspicion, a reminder that in empires built on power and fear, the line between truth and propaganda is often drawn by the executioner, not the historian, leaving us to wonder whether Rome destroyed a villain, or simply erased a woman who stepped beyond the limits it was willing to tolerate.